Well folks, we get another Planet Junior walk behind in the garage today, and this one is about the same era as the HT that I have, the steel-wheeled one. It might be a little bit newer, I'm really not all that sure. There's not a lot of info online on Planet Juniors, unfortunately. So this one does have a Briggs & Stratton engine. It's an NPR6, so that means it's got a 6-to-1 gear reduction on the back of it. And it is seized, unfortunately, as well. The guy that I got it from came from a customer's friend. He got it from a barn clean out and then left it outside for a while, and the engine filled up with water and it seized. And from what I saw inside the spark plug hole, it's pretty crispy. It wasn't just moisture that stuck it up, because obviously you can see the exhaust is sticking straight up to the sky there. So it's going to take a little bit of work. It does have the sickle bar on it, which is pretty darn cool, because I've never had a Planet Junior with the original sickle bar mower on it. They've always come with cultivators or such. So that's going to have to get all freed up. I know the engine plate on this is going to have to get re-welded. As you can see, it's all busted off the frame there all the way down. So this thing twists around quite a bit when you're rolling it, because there's nothing holding it together. So that's going to have to get taken care of. It has the original Firestone tires on it, which I was pretty happy about, because it's a rare tread pattern. You don't see it much anymore. It was pretty big back in the, I think, 20s, 30s, and 40s. But they don't make them like that anymore, so that's kind of cool. It does have wooden handles on it, which are in fairly decent shape. It was left outside, like I said, so they're kind of weathered, but we still have the Planet Junior printing on the inside of it on both sides. This was the better of the two, and I'm going to have to figure out what I can do to preserve this, whether it's lightly sand them down or I can paint them with some sort of varnish or linseed oil or something like that, because I want to preserve them best I can so they don't deteriorate anymore. So we got a little bit of a project. I think this engine's going to take a little bit of doing to get unstuck and cleaned up, judging by the way the inside looked, but I guess we're going to find out shortly. So we'll get this lift up in the air and get the head off of this engine and see what we're up against. Alrighty, so let's get the face of this engine stripped off. I'm going to pull the fuel tank, the shroud, carburetor, everything off. That way we can get to the head and get that off and see what the deal is underneath. So that's actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be. It's pretty crispy in some spots, but you can still see the cylinder wall all right. As you can see, obviously enough, I got to get all that oil out of there. He did dump some oil into it about a week before he brought it down here. And there's some flaky stuff on top of that oil, or down inside of it. If I can get some of it. As you can see right there. Just carbon buildup and stuff like that, but we'll get that sopped out of there and then we can see what it looks like. I got the majority out with the first paper towel. It smells like it's PB Blaster that he must have just either poured or sprayed down inside of there. So here's how we look down inside. You can still see the cylinder walls. There's a little bit of rust on it, but I don't think it was sitting outside as long as I'd figured, because like I said, I forget if I'd mentioned it, he had it rolling over when he first got it out of the barn that he found it in, but then he moved it outside for a little bit and it filled up. But I don't think it was outside a whole heck of a long time, because it would have had a lot more rust, like this really heavy stuff right over there on that wall. That's what the whole cylinder would have been like if it was outside for a couple of years. So alright, what I'm going to do just for kicks is I'm going to clean all that crust out of there the best I can, and then get a block of wood or a drift or something and put it on top of this piston just for kicks and see if we can knock it loose like that. Alright, all that stuff's cleaned out of the cylinder. There was a fair amount of crust on this wall that I cleaned off. Not much of it, just a little ways up. And that's all gone now. So what I did is I don't have a block of wood with me, but I do have this really nice metal drift that I use for setting in seals that just so happens to fit perfectly inside of this cylinder. We'll give it some light taps and see what happens. And it is moving. Yeah, look at that, folks. That's not too bad. I don't know if the rings are going to be stuck in it. If I had to venture a guess, I'd say that they'd be okay, because it wasn't as stuck as tight as I figured. It's got a nice rust ring around it that we're going to have to clean off. And the valves are, nope, the valve's moving, so that's our exhaust. Yeah, we got to clean out that cylinder before we run this thing around again. So here's the rust ring that we have around the inside of the cylinder. You can see it formed from the top compression ring up. That should scrape off of there alright, and you can also see where the mark is from the ring below it, just about a 3/16 of an inch down. But as I said, we are moving now. So what I'm going to do is get all that rust scraped out of there, and then we can roll this thing over and see how that cylinder looks and how everything's moving. And what I'm scraping this out with here, this is just a three-sided piece of tool steel on a file handle, and it works out pretty well for doing this stuff. I have another piece of tool steel that you guys might see me use in the videos that looks like a long file that I use for scraping the heads off, and it's nice because it'll pull off all the rust and everything, the rust in the carbon, but it will not dig down into the cast iron blocks, and it works out really well for cleaning out rust and crust and other stuff like this on engines. Everything's scraped off the inside of the cylinder pretty darn well with that tool steel, and as you guys can see right here where I'm pointing with the tip of this pick, in those spots where it's a little bit more silver than the rest on the side of the cylinder wall, that is where it rusted so bad where it actually pitted through the cylinder wall, and it's just a very, very, very small divot, if that makes any sense to you. So it rusted through the bore, through that cross hatching and everything, and it's ever so slight, and it's mostly on the back side here, as you can see right around there. It probably looks worse on camera than what it is actually in person. So that's the only thing I'd be concerned with, whether I'm going to pull this jug and run the hone through that, or whether I'm going to scuff it up with some 400 grit sandpaper and just run it as is. So what I am going to do is put a little bit of penetrating oil down inside of this cylinder, and then we can roll it over and see how everything goes. So here's the inside of the cylinder after the piston's been ran up and down a number of times here. And you can see where the rust is a lot more defined, where that rust ring was around the inside, or is around the inside. And it's, like I said, it's pretty bad on the flywheel side of that cylinder. So what I did decide is I'm going to pull this thing apart and pull the piston out of here, and I'll show you guys why, because I was hoping that the rings wouldn't be stuck, which I guess is kind of a given that they would be, because as much rust was in there. So if I run this up to the top, you can see if the camera picks this up, that I have more of a gap over here than I do over on this side. And normally when you have a little bit of a gap on the cylinder of an engine, you can take the piston and you can walk it back and forth, and that's, the rings will be moving and everything else. But with this one, if I can do this single-handedly here, I have absolutely zero movement in that piston. So if these rings were free, I'd be able to walk that piston from side to side in the cylinder. Even though it's a little bit of room, it'll still wobble from side to side. But those rings are shoved all the way to this side in that piston, and they're seized right there. So they're not moving, allowing this piston to move back and forth. And I don't want to run this with stuck rings. Granted, there's a chance they might free up, but if they don't, it's going to cause premature wear inside of the cylinder. So with that, what I am going to do is go ahead and pull the manifold off and everything else. I'm also going to pull these valves out of here before this engine comes off, and then of course everything across the front of this has to come off as well. Alrighty, so I got the engine stripped down, and the last thing I have to do is just to split it in half. But before I do that, what I am going to do is clean up this head and get all this crusty stuff scraped off of here before I go and open the engine up. So just so you guys can see, that is the exhaust port right there. And then you can see the intake port is right here, which is mostly just covered in oil from the PB blaster and everything. The exhaust port's got a lot of crust in it. It's hard to tell because there was some watery rust in there when I pulled that muffler off. You guys might have seen it leaking. But it is pretty crispy on the inside. So we're going to get those cleaned up and get everything cleaned up to a nice surface, and then we can split the block in half. So this here is another piece of tool steel that you guys might have seen me in the past using just for cleaning the heads of the engine, and it's sharpened to a square on the end, so that way I scrape with these sharp edges right here, and it works out pretty slick for getting off old gasket material and of course all this crusty stuff right here. So now that the head of the block and the intake and the exhaust ports are all cleaned up, we're ready to split this from its oil pan. And then what I'll do is I can send the piston out this way, which I thought about pulling the crank on this thing, and there's just one gasket behind the bearing plate here that I have to get replaced, which isn't a big deal, but I'd really rather not pull the reduction housing off because it's not really necessary for doing this, because I just have to get this piston out so I can clean up the cylinder and get those rings freed up. There you go, folks. Pretty typical of an engine of this age, and you can see there's that just a little bit of surface rust on that crank on the lobes and everything, but nothing to worry about. So I'll be able to get the connecting rod pulled off of the journal and can push that right out through the top. That was close, got it. Oh yeah, those are stuck. Big time. Here, get a load of those. The oil rings, that one's moving. The wiper ring in the middle is, that one's stuck. Compression ring's stuck. I've never had one of these little Briggs & Strattons apart, oddly enough, after doing this for so many years. I never knew they had another groove up top. That's kind of interesting. Either something was supposed to be in there, or that's just the way they made these pistons. So I get this top ring here picked out. It was all full of carbon, and now I'm just working on getting this oil ring off of here without breaking it, if possible. Though there's a chance I might have a new set of rings for this piston. I don't know. I'd have to check stock, but I'd rather not break them if I can. And then I gotta figure out how to get these out of here, which I think I'm gonna make a pass at it with a small torch and see if I can warm them up, and if that'll help them free up and start moving. So that's still pretty stuck in there, more so on this side, but it was just enough heat to get everything to loosen up and expand. I just have to make sure it's going to move on the back. I can't peel the ring open like this, because then it's just going to snap like that. So I just have to kind of work it a little bit, see if I can move it around with the punch and the hammer, because it might still be stuck on the back side. And just let some of this oil work its way down inside of there. Alright, that's our top ring freed up. And it looks like the bottom one, that one just loosened up too, since I was tapping the top one. Or the middle ring here, the wiper ring. So it's more stuck on that side, so I'm going to tilt it just a little ways over. Spray some of that down. That way it runs down inside the groove behind it. And it'll work some of that rust and corrosion free. There we go, it just popped up on the back side. Well, alright folks, that takes care of our rings. Kind of nice to be able to salvage those. Who knows how well they'll seal in the cylinder, but like I said, this thing ain't going to be getting used for 24/7 farm work or cultivating or plowing or whatever else. Excellent. Alright, so now we just got to get those off of the piston without breaking them. Just make sure they're good and slicked up and everything's moving right. So my ring expander does not fit these tiny little pistons because these things, they're only about 2 inches in diameter. Just tiny little things. And it won't go around it and then pull it out. It's too big of an expander, so we'll have to do it the classic way and see if we can work it up by hand here and not have them snap, which should be pretty darn cool if they don't. Well, alright, that takes care of that, folks. Now I can go ahead and I'll get this piston cleaned up, run through the parts washer and see if I can scrape all the crap out inside of those grooves, all the corrosion and everything else, get everything cleaned up nice, and then we can go ahead and put the rings back on. Piston and rings cleaned up nicely. I got all the carbon and all of the corrosion out of the ring grooves on the pistons, so those will go back in nice. And the rings seem to be in decent shape. I did check stock and I do have a standard set of new old stock rings for this piston, but unfortunately just because of the condition of this bore, I'm not going to put them into this engine because I know they're going to get wiped out because of the cylinder walls with all the pitting and everything. So what I'm going to do now is run the hone through this and see if I can get that smoothed off a little bit and get a little bit of cross hatching back into here before the piston goes back in. Alright, so I don't have a very small cylinder hone here. As you can see, these stones are about the length of this cylinder, and unfortunately I believe it's this one is no longer glued to that foot. It's one of those things I've been meaning to pick up another one of, but just haven't gotten around to it for as often as I really need this thing. But it should work for what we're looking to do here. And it beats the heck out of using sandpaper. I just gotta be careful I don't go too far down and end up hitting the crank, which is right there. So here's our after result of the hone job. It could be a little bit better, but it'll do for what this engine is. That rust ring going around the inside is pretty bad and it is pretty deep, but it's not enough where it's going to catch the rings on their way up and down. The only way to get rid of that would be to bore this engine over to the next size over piston, which would be 10 thousandths over. So what we're going to do is get this piston and rod assembly back together, get that back into the engine, and get the oil pan put back on this thing. Alrighty, the piston and the connecting rod are put back into the engine, and the oil pan is put back on with a brand new gasket, so that's all set. And now it's time to take care of the valve train. So this is the before of the intake and the exhaust valves. So you guys can see just how carboned up and crispy they are from the rust and the moisture being in there. And then the valve seats as well. So now it's time to get these cleaned up, and we can get them lapped into the head and reinstalled. So I have to lap these in. This exhaust valve seat really needs to have it really needs to be cut, and I don't have a valve seat cutter yet. I keep putting off buying one, and it's getting to that point where I'm definitely going to have to purchase one at some point. So what we're going to do is see if we can lap it in best I can, because it's pretty crispy. It's just really pitted and stuff from that rust that was in there. And oddly enough, the exhaust valve in this engine is in better shape than the intake valve was. Intake valve face is pitted. It's vice versa. The intake valve head is more pitted and the exhaust valve is good, and then the exhaust valve seat is pitted and the intake valve seat is in a bit better of shape. So unfortunately, the little suction cup thing I have here for doing these valves, I don't know how well it's going to sit on this valve head, or if it's going to grab it. And I don't have anything to grab those two divots in these Briggs valves to spin them around, unless I make something for it. And I might end up having to make something for it, because I don't think this is going to stick the way I want it to. So this is what we're subject to get these valves lapped in. Just a small pair of needle nose pliers, and it's less than ideal and it's going to take a while, but at least it gives me something to spin these valves around and work that compound in. The exhaust valve really needs a valve seat cutter ran over it. As you can see, it's very well pitted, but they're very small pits. They're not very big, but of course it doesn't take much to lose compression. But I think that'll be okay for the time being to get this thing to run. And like I said, I don't have an ideal way to lap them in, and I don't have a valve seat cutter, so that is going to have to do for now. So the exhaust valve itself has got a little bit of pitting on the face, and you can see where the land is, where it comes in contact with the seat, but there's no pitting there, which is the main thing. And the intake does have some pitting on the land, very small pitting, and then the intake valve seat, that one actually came out pretty well. There's a little bit of tiny pitting, but it's not going to make too much of a difference. So now that those are cleaned up and done, I can get these reinstalled into the engine. So the intake valve stem clearance on a Briggs Model N is 7 to 9 thousandths. So that's our 7 thousandths feeler gauge right there, which isn't making it through. So these stems are going to have to get ground. And just for kicks, let's see where it's at. It is pretty tight, so that's a 3 thou right there. And it's even grabbing a 3. Now let's try a 2. Yeah, it still wants to grab the 2 as well. Alright, so those are going to have to get opened up. So what I'm going to do is set up my redneck bridge port in the drill press for doing these valve stems. This is how I do the valve stems in the Kohler K181s. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with 6 thou, opening it up to that, because when you grind these stems, as I've learned over the years, all of a sudden it doesn't take much and the material is just gone. And then you have too big of a gap down here, and you have to cut your valve seat or lap the heck out of them. That way they sink down and you get the right clearance. Redneck bridge port is all set up. So what I do for this is I have a machinist vise here, and then my valve gets clamped into that, and these stems are just barely long enough where I can clamp it and get it to stick through the other side. And then I have a fence set up here with a piece of flat bar and a sanding drum inside the drill press. So generally when I do this, I'll set my fence up and I'll run this back and forth like so, and then I can unclamp and reclamp the machinist vise and move the valve in towards the sanding drum, which I don't know how well it's going to work this time around. I might be able to, because I've only got about 3/16 at best, maybe an 1/8 inch that's hanging over that side, and I think obviously enough, that's plenty of room, because I don't move the fence when I do this versus clamping this, you know, versus unclamping this and moving the valve stem back and forth. But just because of my limited space that I have here, I might have to move the fence, but we'll give it a shot with moving the valve stem. So I just kind of, I line it up on the center of the drum and sort of eyeball how close it's going to get for the first pass. And we'll set it about right there. And that should, I just want it just skiffing off of that stem, and then I can move it inwards from there. And it doesn't take much, folks, so we're going to pull it out and check it. Alright, so that's a tight 6. I took a lot of meat off in one pass. So we're going to get this put back in here and just barely skip it. And that should get us to about that 7 that we need for our low clearance, low number on the clearance. Take off just a tiny bit more, and that'll be our final clearance for 7th valve on the intake valve. And now we can do the same with the exhaust valve. This one is 14 to 16 thou for the clearance, and it's at a very, very tight 14, probably a 13 right now. So we're going to take off just a little bit, and then we'll check it again. Now that the valve train is all reinstalled, it's time to get the head cleaned up and get that torqued back down. So I figured I'd show you guys this just for kicks, the amount of carbon buildup that is underneath here. You can see I've been starting to chip away at it on the top of the head. So this might have been a smoker before it was put away, or it could have been starting to burn oil. And of course, now that it has that ridge going around the inside of the cylinder where all that rust was, or that ring, it might burn even more oil. But I guess we'll find out. So I'm going to get this cleaned up, get everything torqued back down, and then our head will be all set. Head's all scrubbed up and clean. I didn't bead blast the inside of it. I just chipped off all that crust and everything else, and then wire brushed it down. And as you can see, I got the mating surface for the gasket all cleaned up. That I scraped off with that piece of hardened tool steel, and did the same thing with this, and then hit it with some 400 grit sandpaper, and it brought it back to the nice machined finish. So that's all set to go back on. The head gasket for this thing, I did not have the original style in stock, which you can see the difference between the two with these two lumps that come out. Oop, there we go, on either side. So this one will fit this bolt pattern, as you can see, but it doesn't have this outcropping on the other side, so it might just barely affect compression. At some point I'm gonna have to see if I can find some new old stock ones of these head gaskets here for the Model Ns, because this one will fit, and it fits a bunch of other different models too, but it's gonna be just a hair of a bit different than the original one. But nonetheless, it'll still work just fine. And the head bolts for a Model N, these get torqued down to 140 inch-pounds, according to the Briggs book. So we're going to start with about 75 on them. And then we'll bring it up to a $140 on the next round. Now that the head's all set and the internals of the engine are all squared away, we got to take care of the ignition system. And we're just about wrapped up with this thing. We got to do this and then the fuel system, and then we can get the thing out on the bench and see if it'll fire up. So these points don't really look too bad. They are corroded, of course. That kind of goes without saying, but they're not pitted or worn into each other or anything like that. So these ought to clean up just fine. We got to get some spark out of this thing. You guys could probably see the end for the spark plug wire dangling off in the earlier parts of the video. So while we're here, this is going to get replaced too. And the wire here is pretty crispy. It's very dry and brittle. So I'm just crimping on one of these style ends here. I got a box of new old stock ones of these. As much as I like to put the ring back on there, I don't have a lot of wire to play with to cut back and resolder. So this will work just fine. It is pretty much period correct for these. The old clamp style. There's proof of the date of manufacture, 1947, cast right into the back of the flywheel. So it sounds like we got some nice compression, folks. It's actually got more than I figured it would, rolling it over by hand, especially with the way that the cylinder and the valves were. So I'm pretty happy with that. Alright, so the last thing that we got to do with this thing is the fuel system, and then we'll be ready to reassemble. Up next is going to be the carburetor and the fuel system. So this has the smallest flow jet carburetor that Briggs & Stratton produced on it. It's the one with the 4 bolts in the body. And these ones are notorious for warping, these top halves here, and it's even noted in the manual that you sometimes have to replace this top half. And I've had them come through on customers' machines where they've been warped up like this, not that extreme obviously enough, but where there was almost 2 or 3 times the width of this gasket, where there was gaps around the side of them. And I did figure out how to bend the tabs or bend the corners back down. You have to do it very carefully, but it can be done. But it looks like this one is sitting nice and true for the most part, which is good. So that'll clean up nice glass bead blaster. It also has the fuel bowl on the back side of it, but it's not a shutoff. It's just a sediment bowl for the fuel to run through. Kind of similar to the Ford 100 series tractors, how they have that fuel bowl on the back side of the carburetor. Because this one had a hard fuel line, as you guys saw, that ran around the side of the engine over to the fuel tank. So in disassembling these carburetors, there's a main jet that runs up through the center of the body like this. And that runs through this one into the side of this top half, so that has to be removed before you can split them apart. You can split these apart with that jet still in it, and I have done it before, but you run the risk of breaking the jet or messing up the body. So it's just easier to pull that jet out of there. And you don't always get this lucky. This one was a little bit stuck at the base. A lot of these I've had to Dremel out. A lot of them I've had break out. They do stick in there, they'll strip. I've had to go in with a Dremel with an end mill and recut the flats for a flathead screwdriver. I have a bunch of screwdrivers that are custom made for these Flowjet carburetors because you can get into them with a conventional screwdriver, but it's better off if you have one that's straight cut on the side, because you see how this one flares out like that. So I'd shave them down like this. I'll shave the face of it here, so that way it's a wider blade on the end of it. So I did that to do these carburetors and the larger ones. Make it easier, and you get a better success rate of pulling these main jets out of them. And that came out nice. I didn't wipe the threads. They're a little dimpled, but not too bad. Now that that's out, we can split the body in half. Yeah, that's really not that bad on the inside. Actually looks pretty good. There's some corrosion and stuff from moisture, but aside from that, it's really not as heavy as what it could be. And there is this ventry in the middle right here. This is removable. That comes out, and there's a gasket that sits between that and the stem that comes up in the middle of the bowl here. Sometimes when I rebuild these, you can get them out, and sometimes they're stuck in there. And if they're stuck, I usually just leave them be. And I'll run a tip cleaner wire through that little tiny hole right there, make sure they're clean. And you can get away with leaving them in there just so nothing gets broken or messed up with you trying to pry it out. And the float looks good on this. The gasket shrunk up a little bit. You can see it right on this side, just over time pulled in from the edge. But that's okay, because we got a new gasket for this thing. And the float needle is decent too. It really doesn't have too much of a wear ring around it, so we're probably going to reuse that. Most likely what I'm going to do, well, I might have to replace that seat, we'll see, is I'm going to pull everything apart the rest of the way, and I'm going to bead blast this entire body and everything, and I'm going to reuse everything except for this body gasket, because I think this needle is still good. The needle in the seat, I'll get that cleaned up a little bit. And then of course the adjusting needles right here are still good. That one's got incredible wear from the wow, that's from the air cleaner rubbing up against it, I think, over the years. It's just a big chunk missing out of it, but aside from that, it should be fine. And then I can repack the main jet that goes down the bottom where the main needle is. I'll cut a piece of leather for that and get that repacked. So we'll finish disassembling this and get everything over to the glass bead blaster. Carburetor is all rebuilt, clear coated, and ready for reassembly. So that cleaned up nice in the glass bead blaster. That's got all new gaskets and everything else and so on. So that turned out pretty well. Fuel bowl is all mounted up on the back, and that's all resealed. Fuel line is all clear coated and everything as well. And I just went through the fuel tank on this. It's kind of cool. I've never had one of these Briggs that had the shutoff that runs down through the tank. As you can see here, it's just a brass rod, and it's got a pointed tip on it with threads, and it threads down into this bottom portion right here where this outlet is, and that's what shuts your fuel off, turns it on and off. And then I just cut a couple of new leather O-rings for this and repacked it, so now that's all set to go back on the engine. Carburetor and the fuel line are all mounted up. I'm going to leave the air cleaner off for the time being so I can run it and adjust the carburetor. So now we're ready to take it outside and mount it to the welding bench, and we can put some gas in it and fire it up. Well, folks, with the way that ran, you would have never known that it had a really bad rust ring around the inside of the cylinder and the stuck rings and the bad crusty valves and all that stuff, even the bad valve seats. That's an excellent running Briggs Model N. No smoke or anything like that. A little bit of rust that puffed out of it when I first got it going and revved it a couple of times, and seemed like everything adjusted in really nice and just idled right along just like it should. So anyways, that's going to be it for part 1. In part 2, we're going to be getting the rest of this tractor all squared away. I know this sickle bar is going to have to get freed up, as that's pretty well stuck. And then of course there's a bunch of stuff that we're going to have to take care of on the chassis, and hopefully by then I'll figure out what I'm going to do with these wooden handlebars, what kind of finish I can put onto them, and something that I can preserve them with, so that way they don't get any worse than what they are. So anyways, folks, there you have it. That's part 1 of the Planet Junior PB1 repair and startup.